what advantage? What advantage then is there in being a Jew? Or what value is there in circumcision? Much in every way. First of all, they have been entrusted with the very words of God. Now, for Messiah Yeshua, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything. Do you see some of the potential issues and hurdles here that we wrestle with? He doesn't seem to make sense sometimes. But here, what is he talking about? He's talking about the way in which we are viewed by God. The role of Torah being under the law and obligating yourself as a Gentile through a conversionary process to all of its obligations. He's not saying that circumcision is now done away with and the covenant that God began with Abraham is finished and over. I can't even imagine that. That's not what he's saying at all. So you have to read the texts in light of Shaul's action and other texts too. He says, of course the Jewish people have an advantage. Much in every way. First of all, they have been entrusted with the very words of God. And later, he talks about, what is there to boast about? I have many things to boast about. First of all, I'm a Hebrew. I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. I have been educated in the Pharisee. And all he boasts about, but that's not what he wants to do. But of course there is benefit in the circumcision. It says there is neither circumcision nor uncircumcision, but it also says there is neither male nor female. Now, of course, we know that there are males and females, so likewise, there is circumcision and uncircumcision. So what is Paul talking about? It's all about context. You have to figure out the message and the audience that he's directing that message to at that time in order to unravel some of those words. For we maintain that a man is justified by faith apart from observing the law. Is God the God of the Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles too? Yes, of Gentiles too. Since there is only one God who will justify the circumcised, who are Jews, by faith, and uncircumcised, non-Jews, through that same faith. Do we then nullify the law by this faith? Not at all. Rather, we uphold it. So he says the Torah is completely valid. And by observing things in the way that Messiah desires for us to observe is actually upholding the law. It's elevating it, putting it in its proper place. You're actually fulfilling it, which oftentimes is the very opposite of what happens in our modern day reality. He says, not at all. And if Rabbi Paul says, you are upholding the law, I'm going to take him at his word. Because speaking for myself, he was much more educated, much more astute, much more knowledgeable than I will ever be. And he was living in the time. He was going into the synagogues. He was educated under Gamaliel. And he met Messiah. He met Messiah. And he says that we are upholding the law with this behavior. We are doing what is right. We are walking in its fullness, properly interpreting it. Very much in the way that Yeshua spoke about in Matthew chapter 5. One has to remember the context of Romans and the civil war that Rabbi Paul is attempting to avert. If you've studied the book of Romans, you know that it was a letter sent in great distress because there was a civil war that was beginning to form between the Jews and the non-Jews in the community. The non-Jews began to outnumber the Jews in the community and began to kind of put their muscle, and kind of put themselves, shove themselves around, make themselves known. And they were causing a great deal of stumbling in the community. Now he's desiring to assuage that. And in fact, in Romans 7:1, he says, I'm speaking to those of you who know Torah. He's speaking to Jews in certain areas, and sometimes he's speaking to the whole community, because all of them would have known. Jews or non-Jews alike. He needed to reassure the Jewish audience that he was still pro-Torah. By doing so, the growing population of non-Jews would realize the same thing and begin to treat the Jewish congregants with the respect deserving of the chosen people. The respect deserving of those who are circumcised, who have advantages to a certain extent in every way. gifts, callings, and the covenants were still there and will always be. And Shaul never abrogates that. Bridging the gap. What you find, which I find personally as fascinating, when you look at the word grace, even in the Greek here, goodwill, loving kindness, and favor, the merciful kindness by which God affords us joy, pleasure, delight, and sweetness. You know that all four of those words describe Torah in the Psalms? King David uses all four of those words: joy, delight, pleasure, and sweetness. So rather than closed fist, we're going to get into a fight, law against grace, last man standing wins. We see that it's a much more amicable relationship. The Torah is God's teaching, instruction, and direction. We've studied this. Grace in the Hebrew is chen, unmerited goodwill, things we didn't deserve. His graciousness, His salvation, Messiah Himself. We didn't deserve that. Even the Greek speaks volumes. It's the way in which God affords us joy, pleasure, delight, and sweetness. Well, God afforded us the Torah. And if King David spoke of it in such beautiful terms, it would serve us well to speak of it in the same way. There is no law versus grace issue. Okay? Not when you see the scriptures with a new approach and a new perspective. Now, I highlighted three perspectives that are very common today in the damage that has been done in law versus grace, and allowing that to be such a lofty issue. Dual covenant theology. The Jewish people may simply keep the Torah for salvation because it is an everlasting covenant. Non-Jews must accept Yeshua in order to be saved. So we see that the tablets, the Torah of Moses, is salvation for the Jewish people. Non-Jews, and I use the cross again as a symbol, is salvation through Yeshua here. So, and these three are the least observed to the most observed today. You may be surprised at how prevalent this theology is today. In fact, I won't name names, but there are some people who are very popular in ministry today that espouse this exact theology, who love Israel and do great things for Israel. But for fear that they will offend the Jewish people, they curtail Messiah and take upon themselves a new theology that won't offend the Jewish people. Okay? Dual covenant theology, a very dangerous game, and all of three of these have to do with the distortion of the law versus grace issue. Supersessionism, which is replacing theology. The new covenant in Christendom replaces the old covenant, Israel, and those attached to her, proselytes, God-fearers, etc. Its major focus: how or to what degree are the teachings of the Mosaic covenant displaced or even completely abrogated by the new covenant and the law of Christ? Well, in the next class, when we look deeply into the new covenant, you're going to find out that this is absolute absurdity. It doesn't exist. Okay? Now, the spirit of supersessionism has been rampant since the late first century. Growing and growing and growing and growing. Now, there is an implicit supersessionism. There are varying degrees, obviously, of supersessionism, so subtle that we don't even know we're doing it. Varying grades. Implicit and explicit. For the most part in the body today, supersessionism is implicit. Okay? It's not even, the person doesn't even know necessarily that they are replacing things. But nonetheless, that is happening. It may surprise you to find out that the Puritans, the Pilgrims, were ardent supersessionists. They studied, Hebrew, and they went to establish a city on a hill, Jerusalem here. Christmas was outlawed, interestingly. They believed that they replaced the Jewish people completely. They took all of that upon themselves. Now, supersessionism has been prevalent for a very long time, and I look forward to the day that it's gone. And the most rampant misunderstanding has been what we call dispensationalism, and has done a tremendous amount of damage to the body of Messiah today. Perhaps the most popular theology, old versus new. It pits law versus grace. And look when it began. All of these, 1800s, based on the writings of John Darby, which emphasized the differing gifts or dispensations given to physical Israel and, quote-unquote, the church. Dispensationalists begin with progressive revelation in the Old Testament and read forward in a historical sense. How many times have we talked about that? Seeing the ancient scriptures solely as history? While physical Israel still has certain gifts waiting to be fulfilled in the end times, the Gentile church has assumed the role of spiritual Israel. I've heard this many times. Needless to say, dispensation theology is built on a futuristic premise which relies heavily on Darby's other creation for support. Can you guess what that is? What else did Darby create? The pre-tribulation rapture. Now, if you believe in the pre-tribulation rapture, that's your own opinion. But I will tell you that John Darby in 1847 created that theology. And before 1847, it didn't exist. Okay? It doesn't exist in the scriptures, and it doesn't exist now, because it's not biblical. Pre-tribulation rapture was based on dispensationalism, which means that the Jewish people are still of a certain amount of importance to God, but they will be dealt with afterwards, at some other time. As the Gentile church, we will be raptured and taken up, and the Jews will essentially have to deal with another Holocaust. That's essentially what pre-tribulation rapture tells me. Okay? That they will have to deal with all of these again while we are with Messiah. Old to new. There is an element in the spirit of dispensationalism that is replacement theology. The gifts are dispensed, old versus new. The scriptures are seen in a historical sense, and the Jewish people are again left to suffer and suffer greatly while we all get to be with Messiah. Now, I apologize if I offended you with some of this, but this is my perspective, and it's very difficult to argue with dates and reality. As much as I wish that none of us would have to suffer, I just don't see it in the Bible. Finally, a matter of terminology. I know we're going long here. Rabbi Paul, to non-Jews, the way in which he uses the word nomos or works has very much to do with conversion, circumcision, and being Jewish. That's oftentimes why we get such a hang-up on his use of the word, because he's talking about it to communities that he has helped establish that are being infiltrated by individuals that are saying the only way that you can be seen as acceptable and justifiable to God is by going through a formal conversion. So there tends to be kind of a negative attachment to the way in which Rabbi Paul addresses the issue of works. But we know that he loves Torah. He says the commandment of the Torah is holy. So it's all about context. Yaakov, Yeshua's brother, when he's speaking to Jews in his letter, works has very much to do with obedience to Torah and doing good deeds. So what's the major issue here? A differing emphasis amongst different communities. Law versus grace, as it is described today, does not exist as a biblical concept. Neither does grace negate God's desire for us to walk in His law. What we see is a differing emphasis of a single word or phrase as it's presented to two unique communities. One Jewish and one non-Jewish. Same words, same terms, highlighted differently to express different direction. Okay? Paul used the term works in order to establish the role of Torah and the way the Torah was intended to be applied. We are justified by faith, not of our own works. Yet Yaakov shows us that walking out Torah is the natural response to our faith in God. Without Torah, there is no faith, he says, because faith without works is dead. So, the only way in which we can create congruency here is by looking at the context and looking at the different emphasis and the different communities that these men were speaking to, both devoutly religious Jews. Faith without works is dead. So, is there a real Torah, and will it please step forward? Yes, Torah is God's word that He delights in. He wants us to rejoice and delight in it. It's pure joy for us. It's not legalism. Okay? It's His word. And it is incumbent upon us to treat His word as salvation, to treat His word as something that gives us freedom. It doesn't imprison us.